U.S. Department of Commerce on Tuesday announced a final ruling to impose steep anti-dumping and anti-subsidy duties on Chinese aluminum foil. How will the decision hurt Chinese aluminum manufacturers? China is strongly discontented with the U.S. decision on anti-dumping duties on Chinese aluminum products and will take necessary measures to defend its interests. Will this set off a trade war between China and the U.S. this year? The U.S. also recently labeled China a strategic rival in a review of national security policy. Will competition dominate the U.S.-China relationship in coming years? China is quickly becoming a global leader in intellectual property protection and enforcement. However, many Westerners still see China as the land of copycats. Is China's IP protection image distorted by the West?
Trade tensions between China and the United States have risen considerably this year. The escalation follows a recent ruling by the U.S. Department of Commerce that drastically increases combined duties by up to 180% on Chinese aluminum foil. What should we make of President Trump's top-on trade agenda that promises more punishing measures yet to come? What countermeasures will Beijing take in return? And are we heading for a U.S.-China trade war? To consider these questions and more today, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics and Andy Mock, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources. We shall also be joined via satellite by Robert Kapp, director of the Economist Corporate Network. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yao Ray. Gentlemen, do you think there'll really be a war between the two major economies?
Well, I hate to say this, but I'm pessimistic about the state of trade relations between the U.S. and China, because historically what has counterbalanced the more democratic, typically democratic wing of protectionist sentiment has been the Republican business lobby, I think, as well as this idealistic faction in the U.S. that believes that everyone in the world wants to be American. I think that was best exemplified by Stanley Kubrick in his movie Full Metal Jacket, where one of the soldiers said, "Inside every gook is an American dying to get out." And I think each of these sectors of the political establishment in the U.S. feels disappointed by China for its own reasons, and that we now have this emerging consensus that something needs to be done. And unfortunately, I think what that something is will be a deteriorating trade relationship.
Can you go further a little bit to elaborate the background against which this decision was made by the U.S. Department of Commerce?
Well, this investigation started, I think, in earlier last year. It was petitioned by the American Aluminum Association. You know, this is in against the background of aluminum foil exports to U.S. Rising rapidly, albeit not taking a very large market share. The American aluminum foil market is about $5 billion to $6.8 billion business. And as this report from Department of Commerce has said, total China exports for aluminum foil to the U.S. is only about $384 million. So it's even less than 10%. Okay, but I think it's against the background of more sort of, as you said, protectionist measures introduced by Donald Trump going to come this year. And I think they pick up a target that it's not going to take a big dent into the China's exports with the U.S. I mean, if you think about the less than $400 million in a context of $500 billion, it's less than 1%, even less than half of 1%. So it's not a huge amount. And also, the companies targeted, mostly two companies. They are both, one is in Zhejiang, one is in Jiangsu province. These companies are all private companies. They are, one is a joint venture company between a Singapore company and Chinese company. Another was a purely private company. So I think the victims of this battle is not going to hurt China a great deal, but nevertheless it harbinges something to come. Because Donald Trump said that he's already starting the Section 201 investigation into China's aluminum and steel products exporting to the U.S. That's a much, much bigger market. So I think, and also I want to make another point, what was significant about this case is that during the investigation, the Department of Commerce also released a report, a over 200-page report regarding the non-economy status, market economy status of China along the way, and that's a landmark event. I mean, this document essentially says what future methodology they're going to use. So if they're going to use this methodology on aluminum foil this time, in my opinion, many more products are going to be targeted in the future if Washington, D.C. wants to do that. So I think that's the significance of this case.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Robert Cat. Hello, Robert. Hello, Robert. I'm sorry, Robert is standing by in Hong Kong, but he cannot hear me clearly at the moment. But Andy, do you think this is just the tip of the iceberg? And however, it is an early warning about having a comprehensive trade war?
Well, I hope that a trade war, along with a lot of other people, hope that a trade war can be avoided. But I think that the outlook really is not that positive, because I think one thing amidst all of the chaos of the Trump administration, what gets lost is that I think he really is observing one of the cardinal rules of American politics, which is dance with the one that brung you, meaning be loyal to the people that made you successful, which is his base of rural white Americans. And everything he's done, from judicial appointments to moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem to targeting China, rightly or wrongly, but is being very consistent, being loyal to his base. So given the past year, what we've seen of the accomplishments of the Trump administration, I think that this initial action, it really is just the beginning. Hopefully that the course can be changed, but the political calculus seems to be that Trump really is playing very much and being loyal to the people that...
Total language, a trial balloon, early warning, a wake-up call, whatever you name it. This is highly symbolic for the most consequential economic relationship in the world. What are the options on the table for the Chinese side in retaliation?
Yeah. I think it's very limited. I mean, I'm really hesitant to make the call that we're getting into a trade war for two reasons. From both sides. I think from the Washington side, I don't think they are really trying to sort of initiate a trade war with China. They're just trying to achieve its objective of fair and reciprocal trade, which means to curtail the trade surplus or trade deficit between U.S. and China from their perspective. From China's perspective, I don't think our government wants to get into a trade war with them. And also, I think, to be honest,
you would rather consider the Chinese response to be a kind of lawsuit at the WTO trade dispute settlement mechanism?
This is quite likely. I think if they're going to take it to the WTO dispute resolution process, but I don't think that we're going to take broad actions essentially to engage in a tit-for-tat kind of a trade war. We probably would pick a few products, agriculture products, to do something similar. But I don't think it's going to be. I think overall, it's still managed. This is not going to snowball into something uncontrollable. And the reason that Mr. Liu He is in Washington, D.C. right now, and the announcer during his trip testifies to my theory that this is pretty much under control. They probably already negotiated this on the table, I guess. So back to your question, whether it's going to get into a trade war, I don't think it's likely. I think it's.
Well, this is just speaking of a brinksmanship warfare. This decision by the Department of Commerce was meant to be a wake-up call, just very much like the way President Trump gave Tsai Ing-wen a call, talking about the One China principle. I mean, that could be violated somehow to give China the bluff. This has been the practice and approach of President Trump. Do you think he's repeating the same approach?
It very well could be, but I see this maybe more as a domestic political issue. So in this way, perhaps there is room for optimism in that, on the one hand, I think, as John said, China does not want a trade war, and I think institutionally is capable of having a very calibrated response so this doesn't escalate on the Chinese side. But on the American side, I think as long as Trump is able to show some political wins, and that could be largely symbolic, that then could let everybody get back to doing business as usual.
Well, I mean, I understand his perspective on, showing being tough on China in trade. But, I think this kind of a tactic is totally unnecessary. I mean, look at the, in my opinion, you look at the methodology they use. I don't mean to be, really disparaging the staff at Department of Commerce, but the way they calculate these things is just totally out of whack. I mean, look at the look at the dumping rates they calculate. Over 100%. What does that mean? That means that these goods are sold in the U.S., more than double what's called the normal value of a good as if manufacturing in China. They actually didn't use the cost numbers in China. They pick up South Africa, South Africa, and they put in transportation costs for shipping these materials from South Africa to China to calculate the cost of this. And they use the cost numbers in South Africa for water, for electricity. They pick up the city, Johannesburg. Johannesburg is going through a 3-year drought. I mean, the water rate has gone through the roof, and they're picking up water rate in Johannesburg to do the calculation. I mean, this kind of tactics, in my opinion, is totally unnecessary. I mean, just blows my mind away. I mean, just totally ridiculous. I mean, you have to come to the table and talk about how to solve this trade issue, how to increase American exports to China, instead of going through this, this nasty exercise to illustrate, the legitimacy of this anti-dumping thing, which is totally bogus in my opinion.
Throughout the previous administrations, we did have the S&ED mechanism, the strategic and economic dialogue. Do you think this regular communication has failed to deliver tangible outcome and to find a solution?
Well, I think that this maybe is a tactical move on the Trump administration's part, because now they've put on hold, saying that talking hasn't gotten anywhere. We want to see, we're kind of saying, the American side is saying, we want something. We're not going to tell you what that is. And I think as a real estate person, that's a very tried and tested negotiating
With the midterm
tactic.
election around the corner, gentlemen, and particularly the huge, hefty trade deficit in goods of up to $350 billion for 2017. I mean, President Trump must have come under huge pressure from both Republicans and Democrats before the midterm election, and therefore the bluff, the early warning. What do you think of this background?
Well, I mean, usually the China issue is typically election issue during every,
we are always the scapegoat.
Right, we're always like that. But
that's China.
Before this thing happened, China issue is not the focus of the American politics. It's all about the Russian gate, the Mueller investigation, and all these things. So all of a sudden, I don't think American people right now are really concerned about the trade issue with China. They're more concerned about, this political, the swamp in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's what they're concerned about. About the fake news, about these things. It's entirely unnecessary.
Well, I would add to that and say that I think with the midterm elections, actually the tide is turning in the Republicans' favor, because tax reform, which was widely condemned by the Democrats, and Nancy Pelosi famously said, the middle class just gets crumbs. Now, most Americans are seeing increases in take-home pay, and I think that's going to change sentiment in favor of the Republican Party, which will reduce, I think, the urgency and I think the importance of this China trade issue.
Or is this an issue of error? Is this an issue of envy? Because China's GDP for last year accounts for 15% of the world, an increase of 3% over 5 years ago, taking a solid and substantial #2 position in the world ranking. The U.S. has yet to ground China in the market economic status. Do you see the irony here? Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is, I think Andy touched upon this issue. I'm really concerned about the future prospects of China-U.S. trade. I mean, the China economy is getting stronger and stronger. Made in China products are getting better and better, right? And in 10 years down the road, I'm really concerned about what can Americans sell to China, right? Look at the, big ticket items sold to China right now. Airplanes, okay. Now we have an ARJ-21 is in the air right now. It's in commercial service. The C919 is coming around. So 10 years, how many Boeing airplanes we're going to buy? automobiles, 17% of American-built automobiles in Detroit are exported to China. Well, and our auto industry is getting much, much better now. Geely is buying 10% of Mercedes-Benz. Made in China cars are getting much, much better. So I'm really getting very, very concerned. In 10 years down the road, what can America sell to China? I mean, this is a structural issue. It's a strategic issue.
First of all, we should have asked, does the U.S. boast of any serious manufacturing industry in the Rust Belt? Let me get over to cross over to Robert Camp for his comments on what should be the deliverables from the U.S. economy given the current escalation of a trade war in the early stage, by the way. Robert, what are your thoughts?
Hi, Yang Ray, and thanks for having me on. This is obviously a very contentious issue. I think just to argue the U.S. perspective on this as it is portrayed by sources inside Washington, and that is the U.S. is just wanting reciprocal arrangements. It feels that it has, yes, had a degree of access to China, but not the same degree that China has to the rest of the world, and that it is looking for, if we want to call fair trade as boiling down to this notion of reciprocity, that's what they're looking for. So, China, as the comments were just made regarding cars, currently China can come into the United States and establish auto manufacturing. The U.S. and every other foreign country in the world has to form a JV. So obviously right there, if we talk about structural issues, there is an imbalance just in the way the two markets are accessible. So I think if there can be progress made in that regard, this is where you could see an easing of the tensions from the U.S., where Trump would back away from his rhetoric and stop the threats of the tariffs and so forth.
But I'm afraid the finger pointing at this moment targeting China is not fair. For example, China says, okay, we want to drastically reduce the trade deficit. What can you do? The American side, are you ready to export more of the high-tech products to China? Look, Section 301 has been seen as the most likely trigger for major Chinese retaliation if U.S. imposes tariffs on Chinese production. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross called high-tech the next stage of challenge with China. What did he mean, Robert?
Well, I think, as I understand the thoughts of Wilbur Ross and Robert Lighthizer and others who are key in the trade strategies for the White House currently, they are most concerned about the perception of forced technology transfer. So when China goes after, for example, we see with Qualcomm, they've had to localize their technology in China. They can no longer keep their IPR themselves. They've had to find a Chinese partner in order to access the mobile phone market. So China now has the world's largest phone market. Qualcomm is the largest mobile chip maker. And there's been this pressure on U.S. and other foreign companies to transfer the technology. So that's why they're saying, all right, if you're doing that, then we're going to have to retaliate against that.
What do you think of the issue of IP protection?
I think that is a very, very difficult issue because when we look at it in a historical context, countries that were technologically behind always played a game of catch-up through various means to reach parity. And once they achieved rough parity, then, of course, the dynamics change. So I think that, in a way, there's a certain degree of either hypocrisy or short-sightedness in the way the U.S. is looking at this. So I think that's, one of the first issues. I think the second is that as the world evolves, IP and tangible products become increasingly more valuable and more important, and just overall the need and the respect for IP protection is becoming greater and greater. So I think both of these, we've all seen in China the last few years how this trend really has happened, whether it's intangible products like brands, patents, that all the recognized value has really increased tremendously.
There's always the issue of a mistrust, a chronic one between the United States and China in what is called a new era of a cold peace, not a cold wars. They don't trust each other, citing cyber espionage as one major thorny issue on the agenda of SNED previously. What do you think of the final solution to current trade deficit in favor of China, do you think IP protection will come across as the most viable option on the table?
Well, I want to make a couple of comments. I mean, the so-called idea of forced technology transfer, I'm afraid I have to quote Bill Clinton, excuse me, this is the biggest fairy tale I've ever heard. Nobody's going to hold any gun at these companies. I mean, you are free to come and go, okay? In the early days, we have this requirement that companies come to China, they set up a joint venture, they transfer technology. But these days are 30 years old now. Today's China. No company is, Chinese government is forcing you to establish a joint venture here and force you to transfer technology here. I mean, this is just bogus. Regarding the intellectual right IP protection, I think China's position is also changing. Okay, I'll just give you one example. The largest telecom equipment company in the world, Huawei. Huawei used to be on the receiving side of intellectual property rights. Okay, now it's on the giving side. Huawei's stance on intellectual property has entirely changed. And the change of this particular company is going to percolate down to the corporate China, and of course down to the government as well. So I think we are going to see more stringent and strict enforcement of intellectual property rights. So I think this is not so much of an issue anymore.
One follow-up question on Huawei, Robert. We see two sides of the same coin in this case. For example, when Huawei grows so rapidly, do you think this is a loss of Apple in the Chinese market?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at what's been happening, it's Huawei, it's Xiaomi, and Oppo, and so forth. I mean, China, kind of to Andy's point, I don't quite see how, though, China is like, say, a Vietnam or Indonesia, where they really are trying to catch up. And he's right. The U.S. stole technology, for example, from Europe at the start of the 20th century, and China has required localization of technology while it was coming to parity. But just like your question suggests, Young Ray, you now have Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo. I mean, these are world leaders. So to say for example, I mean, to the other comment that you aren't forced to transfer, I'm afraid you are. If you want access, if you want to manufacture cars in China, you have to joint venture. That's a law. So, yes, you can say you can leave the market, but China's it's the world's largest market. So, anyway, to Huawei, yes, it is competing with China. Yes, it is taking away Apple's share, but I think actually that's one area where there's a little more free competition. Apple's loss of market share in China, I would not say is due to unfair practices. So if there's a strength in China, it's definitely in IT right now and sophisticated technologies. China has done very well in going beyond where it used to be in terms of technology and innovation.
Push back a little bit on that, Rob, in that I think that foreign companies are free to say we won't come to China. If we look at it from a U.S. context, let's say if a Chinese company or a French company wanted to set up in the U.S. and said, we're not going to hire women, we're not going to hire minorities, they couldn't do it. It would be like, you can't, these are the rules if you want to play in this market, even though the U.S. is the biggest market.
Even setting aside these issues, I mean, every country has its own rules and regulations. For example, in the U.S., they have the CFIUS process. When Chinese companies want to set up an operation there, they have to go through certain reviews. Sometimes, a couple of acquisitions have been killed by the U.S. government. So, the notion that in China we have this requirement of, in automobile industry, you have to set up joint venture, is just government regulation. It's not against the WTO rules. And I don't call this a forced technology transfer.
Robert, what do you make of the counter-arguments here in the Beijing studio?
Well, I mean, okay, fair enough. Starting with Andy's point, yes, I mean, we do have certain laws and regulation, but that's simply unemployment. If you had the same requirement in China that, and they do in fact have, China has its own employment requirements and foreign companies don't abide by that. But I think Professor Gong's argument is ridiculous. You are telling a company, if you want to manufacture in this country, you must joint venture. That is a far cry from saying you have to provide additional training or you have to provide extra social services or something to employees. I mean, it's a totally different context. You are making companies give up their ownership of what has created the value of their enterprise. And China is, sorry, it's going to be increasingly up against opposition, not just from the U.S., but from the EU, and now with TPP with the rest of Asia. So get ready for a very changed environment where it's no longer like, okay, just to get access to our market, you have to do whatever we say.
Well, I mean, this is a rule-based system. I mean, internationally, WTO, for example, there's no clause, as far as I understand, that covers the investment regulations of each country. So definitely, I think this requirement in China, in the automobile industry, of having joint ventures goes nothing against any clause in WTO. So,
it goes against the principles of free trade, though. You're probably correct in terms of WTO, but it's against the principles of free trade. And so now China can start accepting that the U.S. and other countries will say, okay, I'll do the same to you. And let's see how we get along that way. And that's how you build trade tensions. I'm not saying the U.S. is entirely right. And by the way, the U.S. is not an entirely free market either. Actually, it's places like Hong Kong and Singapore that could teach the whole world a lot about truly open borders. But currently, both China and the U.S. need to do a lot for saying, I'll truly let in your companies, just like CFIUS. It is an example of protectionism that should be changed. It's not that the U.S. is always right, but certainly China could take the lead if it really wants to resolve the tensions.
CFIUS is not going to change. I know that. It's not going to change.
Regarding the huge forex reserves, Robert and the two guest speakers here in the Beijing studio, what do you make of foreign exchange regime, and liberalization of the forex regime? Do you think RMB takes some of the blame for the drastic increase in our forex of up to $3 trillion US dollars? I mean, that's a lot. Andy?
I think the big issue there is it's both an issue and an opportunity for China. It has restricted capital outflow. So if it were to liberalize that, that would provide more volatility for the renminbi, but it would also maybe better balance out that forex reserve.
Andy?
Well, I would say, it's a very complex and difficult question to answer. But when we look at China's economic track record, of which capital controls is a part, things have worked pretty well. That doesn't mean that it should continue for the, it shouldn't change. But clearly, this has worked for China. In net, I think it has been a positive that China has accumulated such large...
RMB has become one major reserve currency in the basket of special drawing rights of IMF. However, when do you predict that the RMB will become fully and freely convertible?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing to call. But I think we're at least moving in that direction. One of the 6-factor analysis from Department of Commerce, China's free market economy status is regarding this free convertibility of RMB. I think our government is moving RMB to in that direction to be fully convertible. There are several steps. For example, we have an offshore RMB market in Hong Kong right now. Some foreign governments are starting to hold RMB as their foreign reserves. For example, in Malaysia, some of the trades are settled in RMB. So all these steps, and for example, we can exchange freely for things we want to go abroad, exchange for dollars. If we go to the bank to exchange for dollars. So these are the little steps. And I think the Chinese way of doing things is always incremental. We do it trial by error, right? We do it one at a time. So I think gradually it probably will move into a status of a fully convertible RMB. But it's going to take some time. I think if you want to ask me to make a call, I think it's not going to happen within the next 5 years. But between the 5 to 10 years, it's probably going to happen.
I'm afraid the real issue, Andy, is whether China is a currency manipulator.
Well, by the U.S. terms, it's not, because that is actually very clearly stipulated in a law that's passed by Congress. So even though Trump has made threats of labeling China a currency manipulator, but I think we need to understand that the President of the United States is actually not as powerful as many people might think. There are a number of institutional constraints. Given that so far the data, China is not a currency manipulator.
I just want to add a note that when Donald Trump came to power, the RMB and dollar ratio is 7 to 1. Right now it is 6.3 to 1. I hope Donald Trump will call it currency manipulation. This is manipulation in the U.S. favor, I guess, helping with American exports to China, and that's exactly what the two governments really want.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I'll see you next time. Very interesting discussion about the bilateral economic relationship between the two biggest economies. Hopefully the war will be averted. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.